15th. It is 2:11 p.m. and I apologize for being late. Madam Secretary, will you call the roll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairwoman Johnson.
Present.
Vice Chairman Easterbrook.
Present.
Member Betancourt. Member Connors.
Present.
Member Jackloni.
Present.
Member Maderas. Member Scholes. Miguel Nunez, Deputy Director.
Present.
Legal Counsel Ray Lucarcio.
Present.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Agenda item number 1, the board may discuss and vote to approve the minutes of the meeting of February 1st, 2024. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Madam Chair, I'll second, but I'm going to abstain from the voting on the motion.
Okay. Motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Nay, and so 3 ayes and 1
One
abstention.
I wasn't here.
Okay. Is that?
That's fine.
that's it?
That's fine.
Okay. I don't. Right.
If you're familiar with the minutes, if you, for example, reviewed any of the recording or anything else to familiarize yourself, you can still take a vote.
Okay, which I did, and I've reviewed the minutes, so vote aye.
Okay, we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Agenda item number 2, the board may discuss and vote to support the legislation to be presented to the General Assembly by Common Cause of Rhode Island as set forth in the attached legislation. And I think we have Mr. Marion here, if you'd like to.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you for putting me on the agenda. I always appreciate the courtesy to do that. You should have it before you. I'm here to ask the board to support, or at least refer to your subcommittee to provide a recommendation in support of and it has a house number now, H770. The Senate companion hasn't been introduced yet. The Senate's running very, very behind in its legislation. And it's a constitutional amendment that would eliminate the durational registration requirement and the durational residency requirement for purposes of voting in the Rhode Island Constitution. So the proposed amendment would make clear that it is up to the General Assembly to set any durational registration and residency requirements. As you've heard me say in the past, those of you who've served on the board for a while, our voter registration deadline is the longest in the nation. We are one of just 3 states, along with Ohio and New York, that puts that voter registration deadline in the state constitution. So our goal with this amendment, our goal with this campaign, is to convince the General Assembly to enact same-day voter registration. But the first step is we have to get it out of the state constitution, the deadline. And so that's what this is designed to do. Last year, I came before the board and asked your support for a different version of a constitutional amendment. That amendment would have required a system of same-day voter registration. Some members of the board expressed some skepticism of that approach. And so we redrafted it this year. And it does not require that, it just allows that. And so if this were to be referred to the ballot, and if the voters were to approve it, then we would have to convince the General Assembly to enact an enabling bill to create a system of same-day voter registration. They could choose to do a deadline short of same day, but we would push for same day. The resolution has the support of the Secretary of State. You'll hear from in a moment, his office, as well as the City and Town Clerks Association, as well as, and it's not just Common Cause, I'm here on behalf of a coalition of 33 community organizations and other groups that support this effort and would love to have the board support. I'll just briefly add a couple of facts. Same-day registration is the law in 22 states in the District of Columbia. In those states and jurisdictions, voter registration or voter turnout rates are on average 3 to 8% higher. This would take us from being sort of a middling state to almost a top 10 state in terms of turnout. Those states are of all political stripes, deep red Idaho and Utah and very blue California and everything in between. It not only would benefit voters in the form of increased turnout, but it would benefit election administrators. So by one state's estimate, it reduced provisional ballots by 98%. So your poll workers would have far, far fewer provisional ballots, and your board of canvassers would have far, far fewer provisional ballots to deal with. We already have this in the form of a presidential-only same-day registration system. We've had it for more than 3 decades, and it's worked well. So, this is our first step, but we don't want to do this without the support of the folks who actually have to do the work, which is the local boards, our town clerks and canvassers who support it, the Secretary of State who supports it, and we'd love to have the board's support too. I'd be happy if it gets referred to the subcommittee to meet with that group as well.
Any questions for John? Start at the end.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mary, who is the target population for this? Like I'm just trying to get a sense of how many people are affected by the fact that they have 30 days to wait.
Yeah, so, the research indicates that there are certain segments of the population that are more likely to have problems registering or with being registered or updating the registration. More folks who move a lot. So folks who don't own homes and are in apartments or experiencing some form of homelessness who tend not to update their registrations. So that's one group that we know. We know young people who obviously in a Venn diagram overlap a lot with people who move a lot, are another population that tends to benefit when states enact same-day registration.
Do you have a sense of how you would recommend that this be enacted? Let's just assume that the constitutional amendment gets passed and the General Assembly asks you how you would implement that. I'm unclear as to how it would. I have fraud concerns, as I'm sure others have had. How would you implement it to make sure that someone, say, doesn't come in for a day from Massachusetts and say, oh, I live in Warwick now and I'm going to register and vote there?
Yeah, so all states that have same day, they implement it differently, but all states require not only proof of identification, but proof of residency,
Okay.
right? So, currently when you vote at a polling place, you have to prove identity, but you don't have to prove residency. You could use a Massachusetts license as long as it's you on the license. You would have to show documentation. I mean, if we were to follow those 22 states in DC, you would have to show documentation that shows proof of residency.
Like an electric bill or something like that?
It could be, they vary. Some states have a very, require 2 pieces of documentation and have a very limited set of documents you can show. Others are more liberal, including things like, a lease or an electric bill or something else to prove residency. That detail would be worked out in the enabling statute. The constitutional amendment that you have before you removes the durational registration deadline, but also the residency deadline. About 50% of the states that have, so 11 of the states with same-day registration actually don't have a durational residency requirement. So you could move into the state if you signed a lease and you could show the lease that day, you could vote in that state. The other 11 have some durational residency requirement, ranging anywhere from 30 days, which is the max you're allowed to do under precedent, to something short of that, a week or 2 weeks. So that would be up to the General Assembly as well. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah. But we don't have any specific numbers to say X number, like 20 people, 200 people, 2,000 people couldn't vote in Rhode Island because of.
I mean, what we do know we are the only state that has the system where you can vote in a presidential election for president and vice president using same day. So there are 2 states that would allow that. The other state, Minnesota, has full same day registration. So we know that in, I think the peak, I don't know if Miguel knows, but I think the peak was 08. And then the second highest number was 2012. More than 10,000 people use that system. So this is not a trivial, a very small number of people. Those people couldn't vote a full ballot because our same day registration system now only allows for the presidential, vice presidential only ballot. But we know it's in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of people who could take advantage of this.
Thank you.
If we were to refer it to on the subcommittee, would you be able to, would you mind providing us some of those numbers that you just
Yeah.
referenced from
Yep.
some of the other states that are doing this, and just basically just to give us some background on it? I do think it's important enough that we should consider it. But I would move to our legislative subcommittee if it's not going to prejudice the bill in any way. Because I know today is the last day, but it's already been
Yeah,
introduced,
the bill
right?
has been submitted. They're on break next week, so it won't have a hearing until sometime after next week. You know, we'd love at the hearing, the board to be able to testify, but, you know, I don't know when, your next full board meeting might not be until after the hearing, but
I think we have a subcommittee meeting next week. That's why I was suggesting.
yeah, but then it would have to get referred back to the full board for approval, right?
I mean, I
So-
don't know when that meeting's going to be.
But, you know, I assume the board could send a letter even after the hearing if it decided to support.
Yeah, or we can talk about a full board meeting after the subcommittee. So. Commissioner Connors?
Question more for Miguel. On the same-day presidential voting that we have in place now, what does that look like? Does someone need to just provide an ID? They're not bringing in lease agreements or anything to prove residency, correct?
They would need to provide identification and complete a voter registration form, as well as an application for a ballot. But there would be no checking on the electronic poll pad because they're not registered, so they wouldn't be listed on there. But they would receive a ballot with just president, vice president on it, and they would be able to cast that into a DS-200, into in a tabulator.
So assuming this constitutional amendment passed and the legislature approved it, what would this same-day registration look like logistically in the same sense? I know Mr. Marion mentioned there would be a lot less provisional ballots, but how would this work for poll workers? Is it going to be tons of paperwork for them to process? And especially if we're talking about thousands of voters, is that going to, in your opinion?
I don't think this specific proposal is a change to the Constitution, so it opens the door for the legislation to actually be submitted eventually to change the statutory requirement of 30 days. But I believe it would occur in the same method as same day for registration for president, so which we've already set up. We're already set up for that in terms of we have a same day president in every location in each of the 39 cities and towns for a presidential election. Handling it at the polling place would be a different logistical issue if that's what is imagined to happen. But I would imagine that it eventually would line up exactly with how we conduct same day for president, where instead of getting just a ballot with just president, vice president on it, the voter would get a ballot for their particular that they're particularly eligible for, which we do have the ability to give them the proper ballot in that instance.
Madam Chairwoman, could I
Mm-hmm.
add to that? So states that do have this implemented in a variety of ways, many do it centrally, the way we do the presidential only system currently, where it occurs usually at town hall, but Providence uses a larger location. Some do it at polling places. So I know New Hampshire, Wisconsin, they do it at polling places. just sort of part of the tradition of how they do things. We don't have a proposal yet. I think our vision is that it would be done centrally, similar to the presidential-only system now. My conversations with the secretary's office, I think that is sort of their vision of how this would be done. So certainly there would need to be, additional training and for the workers who are doing it, because they would not only be, verifying identity, but they'd be verifying, where the person lives, so they could give them the correct ballot for their community. But it wouldn't, that vision of it would actually just make poll workers would have a lot less work to do, because if a person came in to vote, and normally in the past they would have been provided a provisional ballot, under that scenario they would just be directed to go to the same day registration location.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm also interested to hear obviously from the Secretary of State's office and their take on it before our subcommittee votes.
Before a subcommittee, do you want
If they're willing
Can we
to, or
ask
if they're.
Rob or
if that's
Kathy to weigh in?
Thank you, Chair and members of the board. Rob Rock and Kathy Placentia from the Secretary of State's office. We support this legislation, and just to answer a couple of Commissioner Jack Voney's questions, John gave the peak of the numbers for same day, but most recently in 2020 and in 2016, the numbers were 7,000 and 5,000 roughly. Which, we had the highest turnout we've ever had in 2020. Now, mind you, it was COVID, so I think the same day was probably a little bit less than what it could have been. But I think the numbers, John's right, it's in the thousands. And two other groups of people that I want to mention that are affected by same day would be newly sworn in U.S. citizens who get sworn in, a day or a week before the election. If the 30-day requirement was in play, they would not be able to vote. And then folks that move to Rhode Island from another state who are just as civic-minded here as they would be in their former state would be eligible or ineligible to vote now with the 30-day requirement. So those are two groups of people that I think would be captured in this updating the Constitution and the law to include same-day registrations. But the numbers lately have been close, under 10,000, but I think John's right. The tens of thousands could be eligible for same day.
Kathy, do you have anything?
I know that there were some questions on how the function is now with the same day for voting for president and vice president. So in Providence, it is held at a different facility. It's normally held at the Dunkin' Donuts Center, or I forget.
The AMP.
The AMP now. But what we did in Providence was we had the voter registration. We had a list of all registered voters in the state on a laptop, and voters were required to check in. And although they're not checking in using a poll pad, they were able to look them up to see if they are registered. And if they're registered, then the polling officials would send them over to their polling location if they're registered to vote. And if they were not registered, then they would proceed to register to vote and then be able to cast a ballot for president and vice president. And then in other municipalities, same-day registration is held at their city hall or city or town hall. So they have access to the central voter registration system. They're able to look up the voter. And again, although they're not able to check them in a poll pad, they're able to look up the voter and see if that voter is registered to vote and if they registered on time, and be able to cast a ballot for president and vice president only.
Thank you.
There's one more question.
Of course.
Sorry, two more questions. Mr. Rock, do you have a sense of how many newly sworn in people? Is that, I have no idea how many people are newly sworn in yearly by month, or, you probably don't have that now, but that'd be interesting to know if it's 100 people, 1,000 people. I just don't know.
Yeah, so we attend all of the citizenship ceremonies, especially the ones at the federal courthouse, and they happen quite frequently. I know that at the Johnston facility, they're done, as I understand it, weekly. Yeah, every Tuesday they swear in a new group of citizens. The size of that group varies, I think,
Okay.
depending, but it happens frequently, and we're there to make sure that folks have the ability to register to vote. And folks are really excited about it. It's one of the things they really want to do once they become citizens. It's a pretty cool
I would
thing.
imagine they would be. That's
Yeah.
great. Just a thought on enforcement. I just have a concern. I mean, if somebody does abuse this, have we any, and this might be a question for Mr. Mayor, what is our enforcement options here? I mean, I would imagine registering to vote, you're essentially signing an affidavit saying that you're giving truthful information. My concern would be in the past frankly, when I've been on a local board of canvassers, when we've referred things to law enforcement where there were clear violations, they went nowhere. So there's like no enforcement. I mean, is there any thought of like stepping up enforcement to really, because I really feel like if someone this is not only a right, but a solemn duty that we have as citizens to vote. So when people are violating that, I'm not seeing a follow-up on that. So do you have any sense of that, or has that been part of the discussion?
I think I would expect that should the constitutional amendment pass, the General Assembly would then be responsible for implementing a process through state law, because the state law, as John mentioned, still says that it's a 30-day requirement. So I would expect that the process would be clearly spelled out by the General Assembly. And then there's also laws on the books already for fraudulent voting and lying under oath and all of that. And I can't speak to what happens after names or instances are forwarded to law enforcement, but our obligation is, if we suspect and the board suspect that there's voter fraud, that we push that on to the proper authorities. And so I think that's our responsibility, but I do expect that the General Assembly will create clear guidelines on how this process is going to work.
Thank you.
Just, in that regard, I mean, I think certainly, at least on the signatures, I mean, the Attorney General's done a bang-up job on that, so. We solved that mystery, right? I mean, it's only February and we referred that over in the summer, but.
I appreciate your tongue-in-cheek commentary,
Don't.
Commissioner,
No,
but that's exactly my concern is
Yeah.
I do think that we need to enforce the idea, the seriousness of this, of what we're all involved in here.
Couldn't agree more.
And again, I've seen examples when I was on the Board of Canvassers where there was clear fraud that was referred to law enforcement and it went nowhere,
Right.
which concerns me. I'm not looking to make it like ruin someone's life, but you need to make it show that that's not correct and that
Could
you
not
take
agree
it
more.
seriously.
Could not
So-
agree more. But I did want to ask, Rob, in the 28 or so states that don't have same day, do you know what the negative side of the argument is for those states?
I think that the deadline to register to vote in those states vary. I think there's only a handful of states that have the 30-day requirement like we do. Massachusetts has a 10-day requirement. And I think it's just the folks that we've already mentioned, the folks that move, the newly sworn in citizens, the people that just have forgotten to register to vote. I mean, we all live, sleep, and breathe elections. And when we move, we're going to register to vote. But when someone moves and they've got to hire a U-Haul and they've got to get their buddies and families to help them move, the last thing they're thinking about is registering to vote. And we don't think that they should be precluded from voting a full ballot just because they forgot. Now, certainly there is responsibility for voters, but I think that the 30-day requirement is just way too long. And we're really an outlier. I think there's only 2 or 3 or 4 states that have one that long. So, and by the way, if it were to come out of the Constitution, the General Assembly would also have the ability to create another date, whether it's 5, 10, 15 days as well, which I think anything would be better than the 30-day requirement.
I mean, I certainly would move to send this to our subcommittee. I was actually closed out from a ballot when I moved into a town years ago, and they had off-year spring elections, off-year June elections, actually, so.
Yeah, and we don't think people like you should have to know.
I went to register in mid-May and thought I was, several months early, and I was not.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example of why we should have a shorter timeline.
Okay, we have a motion to move to subcommittee. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second. Any further discussion?
I would just like to thank the parties involved that put a lot of work into this. This is significant, so thank you.
Yeah, and also I'm going to venture with the amount of legislation that's already been drafted, some of which we're hearing today, some of which the subcommittee will hear next week. I'm going to venture to guess we might need a one-off meeting as not to hold it up. I think it's a good opportunity with the General Assembly being on break that we can probably get caught up based on what we're behind, but we can discuss that a little later. So we have a motion and a second. Any final discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. The motion passes. Agenda item number 3, the board may discuss and vote to support the legislation to be presented by the General Assembly by the Board of Elections as set forth in the attached legislation.
Do you want me to
And I
start on this? I
think-
can, this is,
Yes. Yes, please.
so Madam Chair, before the board is a piece of legislation that was born out of discussions relating to the compensatory time issue that arose not too long ago. And in that context of creating a policy that might quantify the number of hours that could be used, the issue arose about whether or not the current staff of the board is compensated adequately to modify or reduce comp time or provide comp time, whatever is ultimately done with that. So the question arose as to what is the situation with the compensation of staff and how can it be addressed and who makes the decision. So the motive behind this legislation would be to allow the board itself to have a little more flexibility in deciding the amount of money that is provided for each of the FTEs at the board, which I believe currently are 12. By way of a very brief history, the Title 17, Chapter 7 of our general laws affords this board broad authority over the hiring and compensation of your staff. It uses the old term of secretary for the appointment by itself of its secretary, which in current nomenclature will be our executive director, and for the secretary's related staff to assist the board in its functions. So the board has the autonomy, the decision-making autonomy to select its own staff and to compensate its staff. There is one provision in there that relates to I think it's called a payroll board. It's one of the boards that used to exist that no longer does. It was eliminated back in about 2005 and placed with the Department of Administration. In the original legislation, it required you to abide by any regulations that were passed by that board. Now, that board has been replaced by the Department of Administration. So for all purposes of compensation that were handled by that board, they are now handled by the Department of Administration. Thus, the placement of this legislation in Chapter 4 of Title 36, which falls under the duties and responsibilities of the Department of Administration. And on page 2 of this, you'll see that the language was added to allow the Board of Elections permission to be assigned a separate and distinct employment positions under the pay plan for the unclassified employees for the purpose of establishing positions and salaries for the Board of Elections employees. I don't think any of us are involved in that process with the DOA. I certainly am not. But as I understand it, when your management seeks to determine what the salary should be for any particular job, it can't simply rely upon data from private sector or even from the state itself. It needs to go within the current FTEs that exist within the DOA system and see if there is a vacancy within or a description that could match a salary that would be similar where there is a vacancy, and then that could be created as the position to be used for your staff position. This is somewhat arcane. It is quite restrictive. It requires a number of hearings to determine whether or not you would even be eligible for that. The amendments would allow the board to instead make that decision with more autonomy and would have its own classification. So you would determine what you would want to have for your FTEs, and that could be then designated as those positions if this was passed and implemented in that fashion. So it's the first step to first changing this piece of legislation and then going from there with the decision by you as to how you want to compensate your staff.
Madam Chair, Ray, just a quick question. Somewhere in the language, either at the in that second line where it talks about positions, or in the third line of the changes where it talks about salaries, should the word regulation be in there? Because I know that we had some issues with the department and their regulations as to compensatory time. So is it something that we would need, or do you think that the language as it is would allow us to sort of modify that as well?
Well, first, the compensatory time document you're referring to is actually a policy. Under our statute, you're only governed by what used to be the old board's regulations. So presumably, you're now governed by the DOA regulations. The compensatory time document is simply a signed document by then director of DOA back in 2019. It has never been promulgated as a regulation. So it already is something that you can seek for guidance and use for guidance, and I think it was appropriately done so. But it wasn't something that we were technically required to follow. If that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, it does.
Others? I have a question. Ray, has this been submitted?
No,
To
to
the
my
General
knowledge,
Assembly?
this to my knowledge has not been submitted. It's just before you now to start that process. I do believe it's gone through, it's been reviewed by some at DOA. There hasn't been any friction to it, not meaning that they're going to run in and, jump in support of it, but there's been no opposition that I know of to the sets of eyes within the staff DOA that have reviewed it. But this is the next step. It needs a vote before it can be introduced.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Just a little question. How do we normally introduce, we have to find a sponsor? How do we normally do that? Being new, I don't know.
Yeah, there is typically a sponsor. The leadership of your management, usually your executive director, your deputy, reach out to the leadership of the General Assembly. And from that discussion, they actually assign a sponsor to you. That's normally the way it's done.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can add to that. We've already been in contact with the Senate President's office and the Speaker's office, and we've already submitted the previously approved legislation on signing with an X and the 3-day transmission on mail ballots. So one has already been assigned the number, the other one is still pending. And if the board seeks to approve this today, if the board does approve this today, then we will send that right over to the Senate President and the Speaker's office to actually submit this legislation as well.
Does anyone have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve and support this and ask that it be transmitted over to the General Assembly.
I'll second it.
Any further discussion? Commissioner Connors, you look like you want.
No.
No? Okay. I would just say, we're going to talk about this at a later date, but once we, I think, get all of this situated and settled, we will develop a more comprehensive and consistent process for reviewing all of this. But we have a motion and a second. No further discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, any abstentions? Nope, the motion passes. Agenda item number 4, the board may discuss and vote to support the legislation to be presented to the General Assembly by the Secretary of State as set forth in the attached legislation. Rob and Kathy.
Thank you, Chair. Again, Rob Rock and Kathy Placencia from the Secretary of State's office. And this is the first time, at least I'm before you, since you've been voted as Chair and Vice Chair to Commissioner DeSimone. So congratulations. And also congratulations to Miguel on his hire as Executive Director. That's a great choice, and we look forward to continue working with the board and Miguel on election matters. So there are 3 bills that we have before you today, and we're hoping that you'll support. I'm going to go in order as they were listed on the agenda. So the first one is a artificial intelligence bill, and this is a really interesting thing that's popped up over the last year or so as it relates to elections, where now there are artificial intelligence tools out there that make it very easy for someone to create a audio file, a video file, or a picture of a real person with their real voice doing just about anything. And there are many states across the country. 4 already have passed legislation related to this topic. Congress has introduced 4 bills as well, and many other states are doing what we're doing and looking into this process. So essentially, obviously these type of, they're called deep fakes, where again, real voices and real images are used to deceive people, are really challenging when we're talking about elections, especially the closer we get to an election where perhaps a candidate or information is disseminated that is not accurate, and there's very little time to correct it or to make the right information available to people. So this bill, what it would do is it wouldn't ban deep fakes. What it would do is it would require there to be disclosure with a deep fake. So if there was an audio or a video or an image file that was released and it was manipulated to make something appear as if it were something that it's not, there needs to be disclosure. And that disclosure has to be something that's pretty straightforward. If it's an audio file, then the voice on the file has to be very clear and at a cadence that is audible to the average person to indicate that the information or the audio file is not accurate or that it's a deep fake. If it's a visual file, the text on the visual has to be in a font big enough for people to be able to read it. I know we're all used to those car commercials where at the very end, you've got a voice that says a lot of things really, really quickly in small print that tell you things that you don't want to hear. So this is something that we want to make very clear that if there is something that's a medium that's been manipulated, that is very clear to people that it's not what it actually appears. There's also a carve out for satire. Clearly, there are images and videos that get put out there that's clearly not real, or it's kind of done in an attempt to make a joke or to be of satire. And that's not what this bill does. This is about making people aware of something that they're either listening to or viewing that is not as it appears. And I'll give you one example. Just last month before the New Hampshire presidential primary, President Biden's voice was used in a robocall to New Hampshire voters that provided inaccurate information. So this is an attempt to get ahead of what is really already here and to make sure that our voters are and candidates and election officials are not put in a position where their image or their likeness is doing something that's not accurate. And I'm happy to take questions on each bill or at the end, whatever your pleasure is.
What, should we do one at a time? Does anyone?
Yeah,
have a
especially if
preference?
you might be taking a vote on them.
Yeah.
That would make sense.
Okay. Questions? Go ahead.
Just, I noticed that there was a carve out for satire and things like that. If any civil liberties organizations had any questions, like thinking that the bar is set too high, the way you've described it in the bill?
So not to my knowledge yet. And we do expect that, during the hearing process, that this will be, folks will comment on it. This was actually a bill that we were contemplating introducing, and then Representative Baginski from Cranston and I believe Senator DePalma were putting this bill in anyway. And so we kind of stamped it because we think it's really important. So I can't speak to whether or not Representative or the Senator have spoken with those folks, but I can assure you that they will either testify in some way at the hearing. But we think this is important.
Thanks. Yes.
Can you just give me an example of what the disclosure would look like the example you gave of President Biden's voice on a robocall, so how would that work? The voice would come through and say, this is synthetic media?
Yeah, so it would, and it gives the organization that puts forth the medium to kind of do it in a way that, for example, if it's longer than 2 minutes, I think it's going to be done every 30 seconds to let folks know, to make sure that they know. Because you're right, if a voice is on there, you can't have two voices speaking at once. So there's got to be a point where the listener, and it can't be 15 seconds into a 20-second video where people have already lost interest. It's got to be done up front. I can look through quickly to find the exact language, but it's pretty clear about how often it has to be done within that video.
And this would affect a campaign that, say a campaign put together a commercial and wanted to use AI in a legitimate purpose, they would still have to disclose that it was.
It talks about manipulating information. So a depiction to a reasonable individual appears to be a real individual in terms of appearance, action, or speech that did not occur in reality. So if it's something that is to portray someone who appears to be doing something that they're not, then that's what falls under this legislation.
Okay.
Anyone
So-
else?
So it would be at the end of the 2 minutes. If it's greater than 2 minutes, then it's interspersed within the audio at intervals of not greater than 2 minutes. So 2 minutes seems to be the cutoff for audio media.
Correct. And in a speed and pitch that can be easily heard by the average listener at the beginning of the audio, at the end of the audio, and then if it's greater than 2 minutes, dispersed throughout.
Any other questions? Anything else you want to offer? Are you good?
Not on this bill, no.
Okay. Does the board wish to make a motion? Only four of
Frankly,
us.
I would move to support it. I know we've been sending them to the subcommittee. I'd move to support it at this point, I guess.
I'll second that.
Okay. Motion and a second. Any other discussion?
Have you had any pushback from, I know it's kind of a weird situation, but a free speech pushback on this, even though it's synthetic media?
We have not, but it's not to say that it's not out there. So I can't say that we have heard of it, but I don't know if others believe there is an issue here. I know that this bill was modeled after, I believe, the state of Washington's, which has passed. But again, not to say that there aren't folks out there that have an issue with it.
We do have John Marion here. I know Steve from the ACLU is
Take that position.
not here. No? Okay. Okay, we have a motion and a second to support this legislation. I think we don't have any further discussion. So all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes, or yes, the motion passes. So we'll move on to the second piece.
Thank you. The next bill is we call it the disaffiliation bill. This bill has been introduced a number of times over the last several years, although last year it did pass the House. And we believe that we've made some updates to the bill that would make it more amenable on the Senate side. So we're hopeful that it's going to pass this year. Right now, unaffiliated voters, when they vote in a primary, when they get to the polling place, they've got to indicate which party primary they want to vote in. So when they get that ballot, that automatically affiliates them with the party. They have the ability to fill out a disaffiliation form when they leave the polling place to return them to unaffiliated status. What this bill would do is it would prohibit or prevent an unaffiliated voter from being affiliated with the political party when they choose that ballot when they go into the polling place. We believe that people who are unaffiliated that go into the polling place want to be unaffiliated when they come out. We also believe a couple of the benefits of the bill is that we think it's going to increase turnout for a primary. We do believe that in today's polarized society that people don't want to be affiliated with a party, even if it's for 30 days. And so I think people sit out the primaries because they don't want to have that label attached to their name. So they'd be more likely to vote in a primary if their unaffiliated status remains unchanged. And then, and I believe that's the most important piece is to make it easier for the voter. But there's also an important administrative piece that makes it a lot easier for the local boards of canvassers. After every election, the boards of canvassers are responsible for processing those disaffiliation forms. And in cities like Providence and Cranston and Warwick, that takes weeks. Smaller towns, it takes less time, but it's a very tedious, laborious process. And it usually doesn't happen until after the November election. So the disaffiliation forms come back to the cities and towns in September after the primary, but because our primary is so close to the general, the towns don't have time to process those disaffiliation forms. So voters are actually affiliated with the party much longer than the 30 days. So we believe that administratively it's much smoother and more streamlined. And for voters, we believe that it's an easier experience for them. Over 45% of the electorate in Rhode Island are unaffiliated voters. So it's higher than any other party. And so we believe this is a bill that would make it a lot easier for voters and election administrators. And we're hopeful that the Senate agrees this year. The House, I expect, would agree because they agreed last year. But we're hopeful that this bill will pass this year. And this bill does have the support of the Rhode Island Town and City Clerks Association.
Thanks, Rob. Questions for Rob? Commissioner Giacopone?
Just the line is added, D, a form prescribed by the State Board of Elections for the purpose of disaffiliating from political party shall be provided at the polling locations. I'm just wondering what the purpose of adding that is, since they wouldn't need to disaffiliate.
So that was, I believe, a request from the elections director in the city of Cranston, because as I understand it right now, during early voting, there aren't disaffiliation forms at the early voting sites. It's only election day. So I believe that was an attempt to ensure that that disaffiliation forms are available. Sometimes we hope that this bill passes in full, but sometimes if there's an issue, some of it will pass. And I think that was the intent with that line of the bill.
And I would imagine that this will actually cut down, talking about provisional voting, provisional votes would definitely be cut down, because I can remember processing those in Cranston. Many of those, at least 50%, were because they were in the wrong party.
That's right. And that's a great point, because I believe that the poll workers are not able to tell folks of the disaffiliation option at the polling place. So a lot of people will vote, they walk out, and then they don't realize it until the next primary when they want to vote in the other party's primary. And that's where you have the provisional ballot issue.
Agreed. Thank you.
I have a quick question for Rob, if I could.
Of course.
So it seems to me that the form in last year's legislation, which I believe the board supported, the form was being eliminated, if I recall correctly. In this version, the form would still have to exist. Would that be solely for the purpose of disaffiliating Democrats, Republicans, any recognized party if unaffiliated voters aren't going to be affiliated?
That's right. Yes. So for the folks who are Democrats or Republicans, when they go in, if they want to disaffiliate, they're able to do so at the polling place. So yeah, that's another reason why that was added.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything further? Someone wish to make a motion on this piece?
Make a motion to support the legislation entitled Maintaining an Unaffiliated Party Status After Voting in a Primary Bill.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The motion
I'm
passes.
opposed.
You said what?
I'm opposed.
Oh, you're opposed, sorry. One opposed, the motion passes.
Thank you. And then the last bill is the threats to public officials bill. This bill simply adds the words "or who is an election official or poll worker" to the list of public officials who, if harassed or threatened, the harasser would potentially be guilty of a felony, of potential jail time and a fine. Unfortunately, across the country over the last several years, election officials, poll workers have not only been harassed and threatened, but also received death threats. Most recently, a number of election offices received fentanyl in the mail. And so clearly we're in a time where it's important that those that are making sure that our elections are run securely and safely are protected. And so this would simply add election officials, folks from the Board of Elections and the Secretary of State's office, the 39 boards of canvassers and poll workers to the list of public officials that again, if threatened or harassed, the harasser would be guilty of a felony. This is something that has been passed in a number of states. and a number of other states are trying to pass something similar. So we think it's important that our election officials and poll workers are protected in this time.
Thank you. Any questions, comments?
I would move to support the legislation.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. The motion passes.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Um, Agenda item number 5, the board may vote to certify the results of the voting equipment tested to be used for the Woonsocket City Council special election to be held on March 5th, 2024.
Good afternoon, members of the board. Logic and accuracy testing for early voting and election day. Voting equipment for the Woonsocket City Council special election began on Monday, February 12th at 10 a.m. and concluded in the afternoon of the same day. The testing was open to the public. One ES&S and 3 Board of Elections staff were involved in the testing. 2 DS200s and 2 express votes were deployed for early voting to Woonsocket City Hall. We actually delivered on Monday afternoon due to the snowstorm on Tuesday. And 12 DS200s and 6 express votes are being deployed to the 6 precincts being opened on March 5th for the Woonsocket special election. 2 additional DS200s and 2 additional express votes were tested as backup units for a total of 26 machines involved in this testing. Because we are currently in the process of upgrading our voting system software version between the primary and the general election, high-speed tabulators still do need to be LNA tested on those units because we had to utilize them in a recent retirement board election and in the Woonsocket special primary. So those units will be upgraded by our vendor ES&S in the next 2 weeks. Those high-speed tabulators, as well as all of the DS200s and express votes used in the primary in Woonsocket, were held back from being upgraded because that actual primary was conducted under a previous software version. And the remaining units will be upgraded prior to the presidential primary in April. The staff will present their LNA testing report on the high-speed tabulator, the DS850, to you prior to tabulating mail ballots for the Woonsocket special election on the evening of March 5th. 36 test decks were fed through the early voting DS8200, and 6 test deck ballots were fed into each precinct DS200. This includes 1 express vote card from each express vote, according to our protocol. A total of 144 ballots were used during this testing. We did replace 0 express vote units and 0 DS200 units during testing. The Secretary of State Division conducted a review of the express vote ballot information and has signed off that this information is accurate per the existing Board of Elections protocol. You should have a copy of that letter in front of you. The staff will deliver the equipment and supplies to Woonsocket to their precincts on Monday, March 4th, and we expect to pick up the equipment on Wednesday, March 6th. ES&S has provided us with 3 reports for the special election. You have the first report is a 0 report prior to testing. The second report shows the results of the test deck of ballots that we used. And this has been compared to the key, which you have in front of you as well, which shows what the results should be. And these results match. And finally, the third report reflects that the system and each machine has been reset to 0 and are now ready for operation on March 5th. At this time, if the board has no questions, I ask that you certify the voting equipment for the Woonsocket special election to be held on March 5th.
Thank you, Miguel. Any questions for Miguel? Hearing none, does someone wish to make a motion?
I'll make the motion to certify the election equipment for our Woonsocket special election.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes. Agenda item number 6, the board may discuss the protocol that is followed by the board when convening executive sessions in accordance with the requirements set forth under the Open Meetings Act, Rhode Island General Law 42-46 -1. And I believe Commissioner Jack Boney, you are going to speak to this to start.
Yeah, I requested that this be on the agenda because at a recent, after we had a recent meeting, there was a open meetings, I guess, violation posted by, or submitted to the Attorney General by a member of the public. I think that was subsequently withdrawn, is my understanding, and I think ultimately arose out of a misunderstanding of what we're required to do. So I thought it would be good just to put on the record officially what we do to officially comply with all the rules and regulations and statutes as defined by the Open Meeting Law in
And
Rhode
and
Island.
I can provide really a very brief summary of that. I think we're all familiar with it, but to put it on the record, it's governed by Title 42, Chapter 46 of the general laws. We follow those statutory requirements. They always begin with, an open call of the board. You always take a seat on the bench, on the dais. And while you're here in open session, you specify each of the reasons why you may go into executive session by separate agenda. So I always prepare separate agenda items for each, whether it might be a campaign finance matter. You might also, in the same executive session, deal with a personnel question. I will break those out, and the board always takes separate votes. In the unlikely event that the board wishes to only go in for one and there is opposition to going in for the other, you'll have that ability to break it down on the agenda. All of that is done in open session, and it's only upon a vote of majority here on the bench that you then adjourn the open session and convene the executive session in the conference room. At the end of that process, you always come out. You always come out and go back into the public hearing room where we're seated here today. And you always note that the matter has been adjourned, that there's a motion to seal the minutes, and then you go back into open session. On occasion, there are votes that were taken that can be announced. For example, where you refer matters out to the Attorney General. When that occurs, I always read into the record in open session the votes that were taken and to make sure there is a public record of what was done. So it's not very elaborate, but it is something that we have, to my knowledge, consistently done, even on the occasion where there was an allegation that we were not, I think the words used, if not by the complainant, then by another who was publishing the allegation, that we appeared, that we may have not actually convened an open session first. That is incorrect. You certainly did. Now, is there a requirement that you have everything video recorded as well? No. We have routinely incorporated that when we have something of substance that's going to take place in an open session. And we do that all the time whenever we're going to have a substantive open session. But is that required? No, and I think there may be times when we haven't, but to my knowledge, for years now, we have been posting the hyperlink and also referring people to the board website so that they could access it through that platform as well. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have, but that's in sum and substance what we do every single time we have an executive session.
And just to
Thank you.
reiterate, our agenda stays the same on our website, and additionally, it's on the Secretary of State's website as well. it's posted the same exact way and it indicates individually what items we're going into executive session for, so.
Yes, the agenda is always posted with a specification of the statute that we're relying upon.
And despite the fact that we don't always put things on YouTube because of the reason you just explained, members of the public are always welcome.
Always welcome.
Here in the audience.
Had the public been there that evening, including the person who was making the allegations, they would have seen that same routine taking place as it always does.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you, Ray.
Mhm.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Commissioner, for asking this to be clarified as well.
Yes,
I
thank you.
think it's important.
And we're not, there's nothing further to be done with this, right? Ray?
Right,
No?
yeah,
just
there's
close it
no
up.
need for, no action for this item.
Okay, then I think we have come to the end of our agenda. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Motion seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. We are adjourned at 3:12 PM. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.